oncologist in Akash Hospital, Dwarka, New Delhi. Yeah. So first of all, I want to introduce to the all new participants who have not yet joined any session of the TUGS India. I need to introduce what exactly TUGS is. TUGS is actually an international society that represents the global community of upper GI surgeons and its various subspecialties, including different malignant surgeries, benign surgeries, other bariatric surgeries, whatever is related to upper GI. And our aim is to provide an international platform for continuous education and collaborations on academic matters and research to improve the patient care in upper GI diseases. For this symposium, our objective is to have a panel of experts to share their experience in rare challenge of pancreatic cystic neoplasm, to diagnose and manage for their perspectives, which includes not only the surgical experts, but we have taken endoscopic expert, gastroenterologist, and radiologist with us in the team to collaborate for its management. Now, most likely we will have, I don't know what they are actually going to teach us or what we are going to learn, but what we have supposed to get the opportunities of different video presentations or the clips for the rarest presentation of pancreatic cystic neoplasm in this symposium. The motive of this symposium or this TUGS organization is always academic promotions without any profit, without any financial support. We do work on different research activities. We do work on the academics. We have recently started on multinational collaborative studies also with the different countries in the different chapters of TUGS as a global group. So in the same pathway, we need to support from all the speakers and not only speakers, participants to work for upgradation of their studies. Now, without wasting our time, I will invite my co-host, Dr. Bhushan Balgat, to invite our panelists and to run further shows. Thank you.
Good evening all. Welcome to this symposium, the 4th TUGS India Symposium. I am the co-coordinator and Dr. Saumil Vyas and Dr. Vikas Jain, the co-host of this show. I would like to introduce the two panelists of the symposium today. The first one being Dr. Tarun Mittal from Delhi. He is the secretary of Delhi State ASI chapter. He is the board member of CELSI, the executive member of Hernia Society of India. And for our residents, as we all know, the very famous, he is the associate professor at Sir Gangaram Hospital, New Delhi. His areas of interest are laparoscopic HPB surgery, hernia surgery, and bariatric surgery. He will also be speaking on the case presentation later on. I would also like to introduce the second panelist of today, Dr. Puneet Dhar sir. He is the professor and head of GI and HPB surgery and liver transplant at AIIMS Rishikesh. He is also the national webinar coordinator in specialty of surgical gastroenterology for NBE. He has tremendous research experience in pancreatic and hepatic disorders, and he has also authored multiple chapters on pancreatic neoplasms in various textbooks, including many on cystic neoplasm of the pancreas. These were about the panelists. Now I'm going to introduce to you the first speaker of today, Dr. Saumil Vyas sir from Sir H.N. Reliance Hospital, Mumbai. He's a consultant surgical oncologist there with tremendous research experience in pancreatic and hepatic disorders. He has also authored multiple chapters in the same topic as well as various chapters on surgical oncology for the help of the residents. He has an academic interest in HPB and liver transplantation, GI surgery, and surgical oncology. Over to you, Saumil Vyas sir. You're muted, sir.
Yeah. Am I audible now?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Bhushan, Dr. Vikas. Good evening to all my co-panelists and moderators, and a very good evening to all the participants on this Sunday evening. I'll just start my screen sharing and just let me know if you can see the screen. I think the slideshow should be visible now, is it?
Yeah, it is visible.
Okay.
Visible.
Fine. So I'll start with my presentation for today, which is basically an overview of the cystic pancreatic neoplasms. Fundamentally, they're also sometimes called as incidentalomas. Most of them are neoplastic, and but we will restrict our discussion to neoplasm, purely neoplastic lesions today. So I would start with a little case presentation where we had this 52-year-old lady who had vague abdominal pain. As you can see on your screen, there was a large cystic lesion in the upper abdomen identified. This was subjected to a percutaneous drainage somewhere, and then subsequently the cyst reaccumulated on 2 subsequent occasions. The patients came back to us. And this time when we scanned her, you could see that clearly there was a solid element which was present in the cyst in its inferior aspect. And subsequently, she underwent a distal pancreatectomy. We explored her. You can see this large bulge in the lesser sac. It's pushed the stomach entirely upwards. The lesser sac was open, stomach was reflected out of the way. And basically, she underwent what would be referred to nowadays as a radical antegrade modular pancreatic splenectomy, and that showed a T2N0 cystic neoplasm with an invasive element, mucinous adenocarcinoma. But this patient had a complete resection, continues to do well almost 4 years after her resection. And so this was worth doing. I mean, one thing that we could discuss later, how should these be investigated? I would go to another case where we had a patient who had a hepatitis B infection, which had been cleared, but he was undergoing regular surveillance imaging. Again, we did a CT scan for fundamentally what looked to be a suspicious liver lesion and found that he had a cystic incidentuloma somewhere in the neck of his pancreas. You can see there was this lesion right at the neck behind the portal vein, close to the superior mesenteric artery. He had further investigations done for this through endoscopic ultrasound, and the fluid CEA was elevated. He underwent a Whipple's pancreatic duodenectomy, and you can see this papillary lesion on the cut specimen, and this was completely again resected, and there was an invasive carcinoma in a IPMN which arose in a patient completely asymptomatic. So I would say that basically we are looking at, these are 2 cystic lesions there. The one to the left of the screen, left of my screen, is a pseudocyst of the pancreas. The other is a cystic neoplasm where you can clearly see a solid element which would enhance on a contrast study, and that is where you need to differentiate, and that's where the role of the radiologist comes. We'll have a radiology talk later as well after that. Can't move my slides. Sorry. Okay, fine. So there has been an increasing incidence of cystic incidentalomas which have been diagnosed, and this is possibly because we are seeing more and more cross-sectional imaging being performed. The cross-sectional imaging is of a better quality. Almost 20% of all patients who are imaged will have some kind of a incidental lesion found, and a lot of these ultimately turn out to be pancreatic neoplasms. There is a very interesting study over 15 years from the Memorial Sloan Kettering group, where they looked at all patients over a 15-year period who had cystic neoplasms. And they found that the study was divided into 2 parts. The first was over the first 10 years and the next over 5 years. And actually there was a nearly doubling of the incidence over 5 years as compared to the first 10 years. This meant there was an 8 to 10% annual increase in the number of pancreatic lesions which were seen. And the mean size actually, which was seen at 2.4 centimeters in the first decade, dropped to 1.6 centimeters in the next 5 years, which fundamentally meant that the lesions were being picked up earlier, the quality of imaging was better, and more patients were turning up for earlier imaging, even in fact for screening imaging. So in 1996, there was this basic classification of cystic neoplasms which was devised. They were broadly divided into 3 groups: serous cystic neoplasms, mucinous cystic neoplasms, which included 2 distinct entities. And then there was a mixed group of solid pseudopapillary tumors. And there were certain other miscellaneous lesions also. The classification kept on developing, and then you had a further revised WHO classification which subdivided serous neoplasms, subdivided mucinous neoplasms, and kept on adding various lesions to this particular list. But fundamentally, it was depending on the degree of differentiation of intraductal papillary mucinous neoplasms. And then you had a further complicated list which came up more recently, where they included certain hematomas, dermoid cysts, metastases, lymphoepithelial cysts, and the list keeps on expanding as more and more entities keep on being identified. But to keep it very simple, you look at this broad-based flow chart. Basically, cystic lesions in the pancreas could be neoplastic or non-neoplastic. The commonest non-neoplastic lesion that we know is pseudocyst of the pancreas, which comes after pancreatitis. You could have certain other rare lesions. And when it comes to neoplastic lesions, they are either mucinous or serous. And the mucinous varieties are broadly two: a mucinous cystic neoplasm or an intraductal papillary mucinous neoplasm or an intraductal papillary mucinous tumor, as it is called. And this is how you could look at the incidence. Almost 30% of all cystic lesions are still going to be pseudocysts. So the pseudocyst continues to remain the single most commonly identified cystic lesion in the pancreas. And then you could have a host of these various neoplastic lesions. So given a pancreatic lesion, there is a 70% chance that you are dealing with a pancreatic neoplasm. The picture to the right gives you a very broad-based classification and an understanding as to how each lesion would develop: a serous cyst adenoma from the parenchyma, IPMN from the pancreatic duct, either the main duct or the branch duct. And then you could have a mucinous cystic neoplasm again from the parenchyma, or on an odd occasion, either a neuroendocrine tumor or an SPN. Anyway, sorry, the screen is frozen. Just bear with me. Just bear with me for 2 minutes. Should I stop screen sharing and start again? Maybe that will help.
Yes, you can do that.
Yeah. Okay, so mucinous neoplasms are a fairly recent entity. Again, in 1978, it was first classified. We then had a revised classification in 2000. And these are the various modalities that you do to identify the cystic neoplasm. So CT scan, MRI, endoscopic ultrasound, we'll have talks on these later. And then you have fluid analysis through cytology, biopsy, and you could go up to molecular analysis as well to understand how this cyst is likely to behave. Possibly this is the most important table which identifies as to how each cyst is likely to be. So depending on the way the cyst has evolved, it would contain amylase. For example, a pseudocyst and a mucinous neoplasm communicate with the duct, so they are always amylase rich. A serous cystic neoplasm and mucinous cystic neoplasm would necessarily not communicate with the duct, so they don't contain amylase. The fluid tumor markers, particularly the CEA, are highly predictive of whether a cyst is mucinous or not, and a higher level is predictive of a malignancy. And the presence of mucin largely again indicates that yes, you have a potentially malignant lesion or a potentially malignant cyst that you are likely to encounter. These are broad differences between the IPMN, MCN, and serous cystadenoma. As you can see, serous cystadenomas are more common in women than males, happen purely in the elderly age group. They could be either a micro or a macrocystic, and these are usually innocent. So unless symptomatic, you don't do much with them. What is important is where you need to see is, are you dealing with an IPMN or are you dealing with a mucinous cystic neoplasm? You need to characterize them, identify them radiologically, look at the various features, and then decide on malignancy, on further treatment, because these have a potential for malignancy. The main difference between the mucinous and the IPMNs are that mucinous cystic neoplasms invariably arise in the left pancreas. They are more common in middle-aged women. 95% would be in women. And the risk of overall malignancy in them is quite low, 12%, as opposed to an IPMN, where 60% of the lesions are likely to be malignant. And this has implications on choosing the treatment. So as I mentioned, serous cystadenomas could be more or less than 2 centimeters. They are defined as micro or macrocystic. And usually, unless they are symptomatic, you leave them alone. You don't do much with them. Malignant change in these lesions has almost been unknown. So, once you are able to characterize them, maybe you would just want to survey them or not follow up these patients at all. As far as mucinous cystic neoplasms are concerned, as I said, there are 95% of them arise in women. They have an ovarian type stroma. They are more present, common in the body and the tail of the pancreas. 25% of these would be incidental. The overall risk of malignancy is 12%. And just like you have an adenoma to a carcinoma sequence in a colonic polyp, the adenoma to carcinoma sequence here has also been very well described. The good news is that even if you do harbor a cancer in this patient, the 5-year survival is excellent at 60%, which is much better than the classical pancreatic ductal adenocarcinoma that we know. As opposed to IPMNs, these arise from the pancreatic duct. They are mucin-producing lesions which are papillary or rarely flat, and they could arise either from the main duct or the branch duct. And depending on their site of origin, you define them, you classify them either as a main duct or a branch duct. At times, you have what is called as a main duct and a branch duct, both arising in the same patient, and these are typically called as mixed or a combined IPMN. And then again, decisions need to be taken depending on the domination of whether it's the main duct or the branch duct which is dominant. So again, when it comes to IPMN, there was this very interesting review by Murray Brennan's group from Memorial Sloan Kettering. Again, incidental lesions more common in males, and adenoma to carcinoma sequence was well described, and classical pancreatic symptoms that we know for the typical pancreatic head tumor could all be present in a given patient. What do you do to such lesions? Surgery is the only definitive treatment. Now, the question is, do all of them require an operation? But operations for IPMN are becoming more and more common. So of any large volume center, when they analyze their pancreatic resections, nearly 20 to 25% of these resections are likely to be for IPMN. So either there is a malignancy with established malignancy, or these IPMNs are potentially malignant. And there is also a debate whether you should do just a regional pancreatectomy versus a total. I think we can discuss that when we have our discussion things. So 3 large centers from the United States put their data together, the MSKCC, Johns Hopkins, and Mayo Clinic. And you can see that basically when this was a large series, you look at of resected IPMNs. And when you look at the incidence of invasive cancers, it's 25 to 44%. There is a higher chance of invasive cancer in the main duct IPMN between 60 to 90%. The lymph nodal metastases will be present up to 46%. But again, when you look at these resected IPMNs, the 5-year survival is distinctly better as compared to pancreatic ductal adenocarcinoma. And if you didn't have an underlying cancer, the 5-year survival even goes up to 77 to 80%. So branch duct IPMNs are less aggressive, malignancy is more common, and therefore when it comes to evaluating these patients, you do need to understand that the main duct IPMNs are the ones which need to be aggressively followed up and treated because of the risk of conversion to malignancy. What are the predictors of malignancy? Obviously, we know this very well. A short history, weight loss, elevated 19-9 and radiological features with an increasing size, mural nodules, solid component, all these basically are highly suggestive of a malignancy. Again, this was the list of things which were mentioned as to what are the patients where you should suspect malignancy. If you have a pancreatic duct dilatation more than 6 millimeters, you have large cysts within a branch duct IPMN exceeding 2 centimeters, or now the recent data has come up to 3 centimeters, or the presence of a thickened wall, mural nodules, all these lesions basically suggest that yes, you are dealing with a potentially malignant lesion. Sorry, again, the screen is frozen. So the indications for surgery include all symptomatic lesions, a main duct lesion of any size, a side branch which is greater than 3 centimeters, a cyst size greater than 3 centimeters, a pancreatic duct dilated to more than 10 millimeters, a cyst fluid which is positive or suspicious. Now even molecular markers like (20 millimeters), that is 2 centimeters, every 3 monthly imaging. So there is this dilemma that which patients would you survey and which patients will you resect? But again, it will depend on all the factors that we have just discussed. But here we must understand that even surveillance is an active treatment. I mean, patients do need to follow up, because this is one pancreatic lesion where if you give a timely resection, the patient is going to have a potential cure. So we again have said that almost 1/3 of all patients with cystic neoplasms will end up having an operation for malignancy, which may be present in the lesion. This is a very good flow chart, came out in a radiology journal actually, which shows that how do you actually investigate a patient with a suspected malignancy or with a suspected pancreatic neoplasm. And you look at whether it's a microcyst or a macrocyst, and then follow a very systematic algorithm, which includes an EUS, fluid sampling, cytology, and ultimately offer surgery to most patients who will have an MCN or a main duct IPMN. So the question remains is, should you investigate and treat all? What is the natural history of these lesions, particularly side branch IPMNs? What is the time to malignant change if there is a risk of malignancy? Because again, one has to weigh the benefit of an operation versus the morbidity of a pancreatectomy. Pancreatic resections are potentially morbid. There is a distinct risk involved with an operation. And therefore, if the benefit is not entire, to subject a patient to a morbid Whipple's pancreatic or duodenectomy or a distal pancreatectomy with a risk of fistula or diabetes, one has to justify this risk. And that is why the role of surveillance versus surgery has gained so much of debate. Again, in a nutshell, a cyst size of more than 3 centimeters, pancreatic duct dilatation of more than 1 centimeter, and the presence of solid element would be more or less absolute indications for an operation. And look at the incidence of cancer. Once again, I come. Any patient who comes to us with a pancreatic cyst, the chance of him harboring a cancer is almost up to 32%. If you are having a main duct IPMN, it is 40%. All IPMNs put together 25%, and a mucinous cystic neoplasm up to 15%. So I'll just skip this slide. And this is again another important slide which actually identifies what is the risk of lymph node metastases in a case of established cancer. And again, if you look at the risk of lymph node metastases in a main duct IPM, it is just 33%. This is as opposed to a main duct pancreatic ductal carcinoma, where nearly 80 to 90% of patients are going to have node positive disease. And therefore, the overall 5-year survival in patients with cancer and main duct IPM is still far superior to those of classical pancreatic ductal adenocarcinomas. So there were various guidelines which have been proposed to understand which patients would require aggressive resection and which patient can be observed. And broadly, the Sendai guidelines in 2012 identified certain features which were called worrisome features and high-risk features. If you have high-risk features, you should be straight away investigated and offered a definitive treatment. If you had worrisome features, you should be kept under close observations, but a large proportion of these patients also go on to require treatment. And the main criteria included duct, the size of the pancreatic duct, cyst size, cyst wall, presence of mural nodules, plus or minus solid component. You then had certain other guidelines which came as Fukuoka guidelines, and they actually included further other criteria like CA19-9, jaundice, and a pancreatic ductal diameter, and looking at the morphology of the pancreatic duct to understand whether these would be worrisome or whether these would follow in the high-risk stigmata group. And then you had the American Gastroenterological Association, which brought out certain other further guidelines where they included the presence of jaundice and the presence of certain other clinical criteria, which included pancreatic symptoms, pancreatitis in this particular classification. They also included an elevated CA of more than 192 to suggest that you're dealing with a mucinous cyst. Positive cytology was obviously an absolute indication to go ahead and do an operation. So as I mentioned, you need to look at the risk of observation versus the risk of malignant transformation, balance it with the risk of a morbid operation like a pancreatectomy. And just to summarize, all symptomatic lesions more than 3 centimeters in branch duct IPMNs, all main duct and mixed IPMNs, increase in size, increased tumor markers, presence of mural nodules, and a dilated pancreatic duct would be indications for surgery. While you could observe patients who had a cyst of more than 3 centimeters with no high risk or no worrisome features, but they do have to undergo very close surveillance, which would mean an MRI every year and then annually keep on having an MRI for the next 5 years or even more. So the last few slides, just to summarize, when it comes to imaging, CT scan is mandatory, a pancreatic protocol CT scan to understand the morphology of the cyst, its vascular arrangements, map out the anatomy and plan the operation. MRI and an MRCP with particular detection of the pancreatic duct would be the investigation of choice to identify main duct, branch duct IPMNs, and the accuracy of an MRI is definitely greater than that of a CT. Endoscopic ultrasound has an unquestionable role and identifies mural nodules apart from providing fluid sampling. And when you look at fluid sampling, you have fluid CA of 192, which has been put as a cutoff mark, where if you have an elevated fluid CA, it definitely suggests the presence of a mucinous tumor. It may not necessarily predict a malignancy, but it does suggest that yes, you're dealing with a mucinous tumor. Fluid cytology, of course, confirms a cancer. And there are certain mutations which can be done on the fluid, like KRAS and GNAS, which again, if you do find mutated, can help to understand that yes, you're dealing with a mucinous tumor and possibly there is a higher chance of conversion to malignancy. Its present role in clinical practice still remains questionable. Possibly we need to combine it with the rest of the criteria that I have just outlined. So symptomatic cysts need to be treated. Asymptomatic need to be classified and followed up very closely. We should do the relevant tests that we have just mentioned. And treatment of cyst will depend on the nature of cyst and risk stratification, and an appropriate surgical strategy needs to be followed. Where you can't operate or the patient is just unfit or refuses an operation, there are certain other alternative treatments like ablation and injection of alcohol, but these are unproven, untested, not very commonly performed, and one would do it only by exclusion rather than by choice. And these are some of the interesting literature. There is an abundance of literature and guidelines which has come across on this subject, simply because there is so much of data which is conflicting and no defined, and there is no absolute. So I think it's a combination of all these guidelines that one needs to see before one can take a final decision on treatment of an individual patient. So I'll end my talk here. Thank you very much for your patient listening.
Thank you, Dr. Saumil. It was such a wonderful talk, and you summarized it so well of all the silent points.
Hello. We can't hear you.
Hello, Dr. Tarun.
Yeah, can't hear you. Yeah.
Dr. Tarun, we cannot hear you. Hello,
Yes, Dr. Vikas. I can't hear Dr. Tarun. Yes.
Dr. Tarun. No, we cannot hear you, Dr. Tarun.
He's not shown as muted, so I think you'll have to log in and log out.
Dr. Vikas, should I start my presentation in that case? Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me? Dr. Vyas,
Yeah.
Dr. Chen.
Yes, yes, Dr. Rahul, we can hear you.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, you're audible. Yeah.
Good evening to everyone. Thank you, Dr. Jain, Dr. Vyas, and to the entire team of TUGS for this kind invitation. I'm really going to talk today about approach to cystic lesions of pancreas from the endoscopy perspective. There's going to be a lot of overlap with Dr. Vyas's presentation and possibly a little bit with Dr. Meenal's presentation, but I'll keep my non-endoscopy slides to the minimum. I'd like to thank my team at the Ideal Care at Raheja Hospital for this help. So what's different from before and now? In terms of endoscopy, CT, MRI, we definitely have a better CT slicing imaging, better MRI modalities of imaging, and definitely much more superior endoscopic imaging. So endoscopic ultrasound has really transformed the way we approach not only the pancreatic cystic lesions, but a whole array of diseases in the GI tract. What is also better in terms of endoscopies, we have a better tissue acquisition from the previous fine tissue cytology slides that we used many years ago. We've replaced that with biopsy sampling. We have trans-US guided micro forceps called the Mori forceps. We can take a biopsy from the lining of the cyst of the pancreatic lesions. There's a lot of advancement in technology. We have confocal laser endocytoscopy where we can image the cells on a microscopic levels. So there's a huge array of changes which have happened in the technology front that has changed our approach to cystic pancreatic lesions. As Dr. Vyas mentioned, we have a better biochemical and genetic analysis. There's KRAS mutation, the GNAS mutation, next-gen sequencing. There's also other assays that we can do on the fluid to help us to gauge whether these cysts are malignant in nature or not. Of course, the better surgical outcomes, better chemotherapy outcomes, and we can also resect some of these lesions endoscopically by either US-guided alcohol ablation or paclitaxel injection, etc. So I'm not going to go too much into the different types, solid, cystic, and mixed kind of lesions. We're going to focus on the cystic lesions. Couple of quick slides on the solid pancreatic lesions. As you already know, a bulk of these lesions are adenocarcinomas, and a small proportion of these lesions are only benign cystic lesions. So we're dealing with a very small subset of pancreatic lesions here. So what happens in people with pancreatic lesions is we do have a suspicion of a cystic or a solid lesion, and we recommend surgery, which, as you know, is quite morbid in nature. And in literature, there's about a 12% chance of recommending unnecessary surgery in these patients. Very briefly, as you already know, EUS and CT are both equally good imaging modalities for staging pancreatic diseases. EUS is fantastic when it comes to tumor localization, to look at the portal vein and the SMV involvement, but it is not good in distant mets. The same way, EUS is very, very good at picking up exactly the site of the lesion, pancreatic neck, tail, body, wherever it is. It gives you a kind of a 3D reconstruction before surgery. So EUS can be quite helpful in patients who are borderline resectable, where you want to see if the lesion is abutting the portal vein, abutting the SMV, are there any peri-lesional lymph nodes? It's really, really helpful in these cases. Sorry. Just 1 second, it froze again, bear with me. So coming to EUS evaluation of pancreatic masses, what is really important for my perspective to the surgeon, to the patient, is that whether we can stage this disease accurately. So whether there's bile duct dilatation, so is the patient jaundice, is the PD dilated, is it more than the upper limit of normal, is a lesion causing PD obstruction, which is the most important. The moment the PD is dilated beyond the obstruction, there's a very high chance that this is a malignant lesion. We can accurately stage the vascular involvement, and we can probably sometimes even look at the duodenal infiltration in these patients and small lymph nodes around the pancreatic lesion. So in these pictures that I've portrayed here, these are different aspects of where we see beautiful transgastric or transduodenal EUS pictures of the anatomy of the pancreas and the related structures. So very briefly again, Dr. Meenal is going to mention this as well. that the accuracy of all the three imaging modalities, CT, MR, EUS, at the current stage, the sensitivity of MRI is 73%, EUS is 69%, and the negative predictive value of CT is just about 50 to 70%. So none of these imaging modalities would guarantee that the patient will be resectable on table. So even with the best modalities, there is a chance that we may open up the patient and we find that this patient is not resectable. So it's very important to keep that in mind. EUS can help in patients with disease localization, but it's very insensitive in chronic pancreatitis. Of course, if the lesion is smaller than 2 centimeters, again, the sensitivity and specificity of any of the imaging modalities becomes very low. So until 2004, there were multiple publications on EUS being superior to CT, but I think that doesn't hold true anymore. Meta-analysis published in 2006 said that CT probably is equivalent or better than EUS for staging of pancreatic lesions, especially if they're more than 3 centimeters. A quick slide about the EUS guided FNA. It approaches a fantastic sensitivity and specificity of 98%, but it's exactly the opposite in cystic lesions. So you have only about 38 to 54% of patients you'll be able to diagnose accurately on EUS FNA, a diagnosis before surgery. So I'll keep this brief because Dr. Vyas already mentioned cystic lesions can be mucinous, non-mucinous, or can be cystic degenerations in a solid neoplasm, like a necrotic pancreatic NET, could be a necrotic adeno, could be a pseudopapillary neoplasm, or it could also be something like tuberculosis, autoimmune pancreatitis, or lesions like lymphoma can also cause cystic degeneration in the lesions. So it's very important to diagnose these patients before surgery is contemplated. So I mentioned this before. I'm not going to go too much in detail, but the most important aspect of endoscopy is 2 things. One is we can obtain fluid sampling for analysis, which I'll come to in detail. And what we can now do, that we can do a contrast harmonic EUS, where there is a contrast agent called Sonoview, Sonazoid, etc. available, which is essentially a micro bubbles of sodium hexafluoride. And they are ultrasound contrast agents. The moment you inject Sonoview into a patient, you're able to enhance these lesions and give a characteristic, whether it's malignant or non-malignant. Something quite similar to elastography of the liver, elastography of the pancreas also exists, where if the lesion is hard, we can pick it up on EUS and give you a pretty much good diagnostic capability. What is also now available is a trans-EUS guided microbiopsy forceps. And we also have a trans-EUS guided confocal laser endocytoscopy, which can enhance our diagnosis. Sorry, yeah. Coming to 3 images here. One, we have a CT on the left side, EUS on the right, and a surgical specimen of a SCN, serous cystadenoma. Tends to happen in women. Malignant potential is extremely low or even rarely ever possible. There's no PD connection. So what we can tell you on EUS, it's a microcystic lesion, a honeycomb pattern. There may be a central sunburst calcification on CT, but we can tell you for sure that this lesion is not connected to the pancreatic duct. In which case, in a typical woman of a young age, we would be quite happy to say this is a SCN and not a mucinous lesion. Coming to MCNs, they are always present in women more often than not. They can have a malignant potential if they're high CEA. They have a PD connection, which is also unlikely, but if they do have, then there's a differential between IPMN, pseudocyst, or MCN, in which case you want to biopsy these lesions. If they're less than 3 to 4 centimeters, you may be able to observe them. If they're more than 4 centimeters, for sure, we need to operate these patients. So they give you a typical appearance on EUS, where they have a well-defined wall, they have some mucinous content, and you aspirate these fluid, it can be quite slicky, slimy. What is new is that we can, additional to the CEA, we can offer something called cyst fluid glucose analysis, which is a new kid on the block. The lower the glucose, the higher chance of malignant transformation of these mucinous cysts. Coming to IPMNs, this is a very difficult diagnosis when it comes to CT, MRI, and EUS. They tend to be male predominant. It may be attached to the main duct or the branch duct. In either case, they can be quite tricky in appearance, like grape-like nodular. They always tend to have PD connection. When they're single cystic lesions, they may be mistaken for pseudocyst. Hence, we do a cyst fluid amylase levels. If they're more than 250, it's more than likely to be a pseudocyst. If it's less than 250, it may not be. But this is not a definitive diagnosis. The US appearances can be quite typical. Coming to SPEN, pseudopapillary tumors, they once again happen to be in young women. The malignant potential is there, and they always need an oncological resection. They have a part solid and a part cystic component. They often don't have a PD connection, and we can identify that on EUS in these patients. Very rarely, we find what we call cystic pancreatic neoplasms, where the NET has a cystic degeneration. They often tend to be in MEN type 1 association. There's no gender predisposition. And what you see in the right image is you have a elastography of the pancreas done. The bluer the image is, the harder the lesion is. And moment turns to yellow or red, it is a softer lesion. So the bluer the lesion, which means harder it is, there's a higher chance of a malignant transformation of these lesions. So as Dr. Vyas mentioned, I would like to just reiterate the facts that if a lesion has a solid component, if the main duct is dilated beyond 10, but beyond 5 is what we start to worry. If the cyst is beyond 3 centimeter lesion, thickened walls, mural nodules, abrupt change in size of the PD, lymph nodes around the region would give you alarm bells. So any of these lesions which have any of these features must be taken as high risk and must be offered a definite surgical intervention if they're fit enough to have it done. So as I said to you before, the fluid analysis is what we really help you guys with. If they are highly viscous, they have high CEA, we have a cytology which is positive, or we can do a gene analysis, KRAS, GNAS, or next-gen sequencing, then we are definitely sure that this is a malignant transformation of the cystic lesion. What they say is a cyst level CEA of more than 192 is diagnostic, but the moment it approaches more than 800, you're pretty much sure that this is a malignant transformation of the cyst. So as I mentioned before, there is a new kid on the block, which is called the microbiopsy forceps. It's called a Mori forceps. It's through the EUS FNA needle. There is a standard forceps which goes into the cystic lesion. We're able to sample the cyst wall, which is extremely important for patients' outcome, in especially patients who have a smaller than 3 centimeter cyst, and there's no PD communication, and the patient needs to have an answer. So there was a meta-analysis published recently, which says that this is a safe technique. The pooled sensitivity and specificity ranges between 88 and 96%, with very few adverse events of bleeding pancreatitis. And the cytology is very useful in these patients. My last slide, but very important, I think is very, very important, is that do we biopsy all the cysts that we see? So we get a lot of referrals nowadays because of the COVID era. We have a lot of HRCTs which pick up incidental problems in the pancreas. And it is very clear from multiple guidelines, the Pancreatic Association, the AGA, the European Association, they all said that if you have a cyst which is less than 3 centimeters without worrying features, you are quite okay to leave these patients at a 6-monthly follow-up. Either a simple trans-abdominal ultrasound may suffice, or you may choose to do an MRI scan in 3 to 6 months' time. Should the cyst size change by more than a centimeter in 6 months, then there's a reason to do an EUS-guided sampling. If the cyst has got worrying features, you go straight for biopsy and treatment. There is a small risk of pancreatitis when you go transpancreatic. We do have complications like bleeding. Very rarely, but we do find people with pancreatitis, and that can be self-limiting. So, but we should not biopsy all the lesions of the pancreas if not required. So thank you very much for the kind opportunity. We are located at Raheja Hospital, Mahim. We do run a school of endoscopic ultrasound here. So people are free to welcome to visit us anytime. Thank you very much. So I'll just stop screen sharing, sorry. Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Any questions?
Hello.
Yeah.
Dr. Raghav, we will take the question answers after completing all the presentations.
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah. And we'll take the third presentations. Dr. Puneet can introduce the next speaker, please.
Yeah, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Minal Chaudhary, who's a consultant radiologist and heading the Department of Radiology at Akash. Education from Government Medical College Chandigarh and the INMAS and subsequent residency at LNJP and Safdarjung hospitals, several national and international publications to her credit, and a special interest in women and abdominal imaging and other advanced imaging techniques. I think we can, Dr. Minal, would you
Hi,
like to?
am I audible?
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for the kind words and thank you for the opportunity. So I am taking care of Department of Radiology and Intervention Radiology at Akash Healthcare Super Speciality Hospital, which is located in Dwarka, and we have completed 4 years of our operations. After the wonderful presentations by Dr. Shah and Dr. Vyas, I think my job is very, very limited to now identifying various lesions and a systems approach to identify the cystic lesions of pancreas on imaging and to ask to ask the right questions to the radiologist as to what is the diagnosis and how we've reached to a diagnosis. So I think I'll skip the
Minal,
rest of
your
the
voice
slides.
is echoing.
My voice is echoing. Is it any better?
Yeah, now right.
Yeah. Okay. So, so as I said, my goal will now be very limited to just identification.
I think somebody has two devices in the same room or close to each other. That's why the echo comes. So whoever has that, please.
Is it any better? Can I carry on?
Yeah. It's clear
Yeah,
now.
thank you. As we've already seen, the WHO classification of cystic pancreatic lesions has evolved and now looks like this, which is quite complicated and which involves a lot of histopathology into it. But what we will do is to make it very, very simple, taking the radiologist point of view and a systems approach. As I said, we will follow a flow chart and understand how we diagnose cystic pancreatic lesion and how we help the surgeon and the patient in the management of the lesion. So pretty much cystic lesions of the pancreas, if we see 90% gets covered under the following heads, which are the pseudocyst of pancreas, serous cystadenoma, mucin-containing lesions, which are IPMN, mucinous cystadenoma, adenocarcinoma, cystic cystadenocarcinoma, solid papillary epithelial neoplasm, which is called SPEN. So other rare pancreatic cystic lesions, which can be epithelial cysts, cystic islet tumors. We saw cystic neuroendocrine tumors, adenocarcinoma with cystic degenerations. These are rare, but we will stick our approach to 90% of the lesions. And then, of course, these are the histological diagnoses unless proven otherwise. So let's talk about the clinical presentation, how the patient presents and how it helps us radiologists in making our diagnosis. So if a patient is symptomatic, more often than not, if we are dealing with a unilocular cyst, it is a pseudocyst. If the patient is asymptomatic and we see a unilocular cyst less than 3 centimeters in size, asymptomatic patients, we are dealing with something benign and, we kind of a no-touch lesion, or maybe, if we see some kind of red flags, we kind of alert the managing surgeon or the doctor about it. So patient presenting with acute abdomen pain, recurrent acute abdomen pain, even if it is little complicated, our minds go towards a pseudocyst or a complicated pseudocyst. That's what I wanted to say. So otherwise, even the malignant lesion, they typically are asymptomatic and they can present with pressure symptoms such as jaundice, recurrent pancreatitis, Advanced form can present as weight loss, vomiting, pain, jaundice. So these are the gamut of clinical features which we take the clinical history before making a diagnosis for the patient. What is the role of imaging? So imaging, of course, as everyone has said, plays a vital role these days with the kind of imaging sequences we have, with the kind of advancements in the imaging which we have seen in the late last decade. So imaging plays an important role. Dynamic CT of pancreas, as well as thin and thick slab of MRI of the CT, MRCP sequences, they kind of sometimes give the histopathological diagnosis on radiological imaging as well. So now starting with the morphological classification of pancreatic tumors, what we see in radiology. So pretty much we define cystic tumors into 4 categories. One is unilocular cyst, the other is multilocular cyst, which are microcysts, spongiform pattern. Then again, a macrocyst, cyst with septation. This is the third morphology, which we see on the imaging sequences, whether it is ultrasound, CT, or MRI. And the fourth one is a cyst with solid components, mural nodules, enhancing nodules, solid components within. So now I'm tagging the disease with the kind of morphology. Most common disease, if we see a unilocular cyst, our mind goes to thinking about pseudocyst, IPMN, mucinous cyst adenoma. If we see a multiple microcysts, so we define microcyst when they are few to up to 2 centimeter in size, a cluster of cyst which measures from few to 2 centimeter in size, and then there are more than 6 cysts together. We call it a microcystic appearance, a spongiform appearance, and the only diagnosis we have in our mind is serous cyst adenoma. Although we see such typical appearances in less than 25% of the cases, but if we see it, it's a histopathological diagnosis given by radiology. We might see a central scar within the spongiform kind of a pattern. If we come to the macrocystic type, we think of mucinous cyst adenoma more often than not, IPMN, and lymphoepithelial cyst. Whereas if we see a solid component in between a cystic lesion, our mind goes towards mucinous cystic neoplasms, which include mucinous cyst adenoma, cystadenocarcinoma, IPMN, solid and papillary epithelial neoplasm, we call it SPEN, or sometimes solid neoplasms with cystic degeneration. So what about the unilocular cysts? So when we see a unilocular cyst, how do we go about it? How do we think about what to give the diagnosis? So unilocular cyst, how do they appear? They appear very well-defined, hypodense on CT. Just one second, allow me a moment. Just pick my marker. So unilocular cysts appear as very, very well-defined hypodense cyst, which in this case is appearing in the body and the tail of the pancreas, which shows a regular homogeneous appearance on CT and does not show any enhancement or a mural nodule or a septae or debris inside. So if we come to MRI, we see on T1 weighted images, it shows a very hypo-intense appearance, and on heavy T2 weighted sequences, it is giving a uniform hyper-intense appearance. So this is an uncomplicated unilocular cyst, most likely a pseudocyst if the patient is symptomatic. So similar unilocular cyst we see in this case, where the cyst is seen here on a CT, a hypodense cyst, uniform, unilocular, and on MRCP sequence, on heavy T2 weighted images, we see a hyper intense cyst which has this communication with the pancreatic duct. So this came out to be a side branch IPMN, presenting as a unilocular cyst, incidental finding. Another case of multiple unilocular simple cysts in pancreas in a case of von Lippel-Hindle disease. This appears like this, multiple cysts, and we also saw cysts in liver and kidneys in this simple cysts. Here again, another unilocular pseudocyst seen in the region of body and tail, function of body and tail. The same patient on MR images. So these were the kind of lesions. We label them as unilocular cyst, and the kind of appearances we see on unenhanced CT and on MRI. However, with complications, the appearance of these lesions, they change. With hemorrhage, they become hyperdense. With some debris, we see a leveling inside. So with the calcification, which are better picked up on CT, we see hyperdense calcifications along with it. So the more complicated the cyst becomes, the appearances change as such. So now coming to the second morphological lesion, which we will discuss today, which is the microcystic lesion and how it looks on the imaging. So here we see a microlobulated cystic lesion with some internal septations on CT, axial and coronary formats, present in the region of head of the pancreas in a female, and this came out to be serous cystadenoma. Very, very typical appearance. We can see the enhancing septae within, but giving us a similar enhancement pattern as compared to the pancreas. So this is a journal image of CT of serous cystadenoma, similar kind of enhancement seen within the serous cystadenoma present in the head region of the pancreas with a central stellate scar. Sometimes we can see calcification within the stellate scar. This is like a histological diagnosis we give on CT of the patient, that it's serous cystadenoma. We can just keep the patient on follow-up as the malignant potential is quite low in this. MRI gives us a beautiful characterization of the microcysts and the septae within and the kind of spongiform appearance. In this case, we can also see cysts present in liver, again, a case of von Hippel-Lindau disease. Calcification can be picked up. Central stellate scar calcification can be picked up nicely. I'm seeing some arrows. Is there anyone trying to communicate something? Okay. Okay. So for microcystic kind of morphology, we have just one diagnosis in our mind, which is serous cystadenoma, as I said. And what we do is, if we have 4 out of these 5 morphological appearances on imaging, we label it as serous cystadenoma without any doubt. So location in the pancreatic head, wall thickness less than 2 millimeter in size, a microlobulated contour as we saw, lack of communication with the pancreatic duct, and minimal wall enhancement. Now coming up to the third morphological appearance, which is a macrocystic lesion, where we have a cyst with internal septae, which also enhance. 2 of the major diagnoses when we see these kind of lesions are mucinous cystic neoplasms and IPMNs. So this is a CT, axial and coronary format of a patient which shows multiloculated lesions with internal septa, a few of them showing thick septa with enhancement of the septa within. So this is, we don't see any communication with the duct. I mean, we have to do an MRI and we have to do a curvilinear reformats for that. But yeah, in the current sequences, we don't see any communication with the duct. We don't see any invasion of the surrounding vasculature. We see displacements of surrounding vasculature and organs. We will keep it as benign. Looking at the sequences, this is again a patient of mucinous cystadenoma. I'm not saying benign in this case. The lesion is quite big, and it is also showing peripheral calcifications, which we see in malignancy. The enhancement of the septa is quite vivid. We see So peripheral calcification, when we see in the case of mucinous cyst adenoma, the chances of malignancy were really high. This is a journal picture of CT of mucinous cyst adenoma, which shows well circumscribed, non-enhancing low density lesion in distal body and pancreas. So same patient with MRI, where we see FATSAT T2 weighted images showing a hyper intense lesion in the body and tail of pancreas, which is hyper intense on FATSAT T1 weighted images, and show enhancement of the wall, subtle delayed enhancement of the wall of the lesion. This is again, again a lesion which shows, which is a multiseptated lesion present in the body of the pancreas, which shows solid intramural nodule, if you can see, which is enhancing on contrast. This is the nodule which is enhancing. See my marker there. So now coming on to intraductal papillary mucinous neoplasm, which can present as we saw. So there are pair of two types, main duct IPMN and side duct IPMN. They can present as unilocular cystic lesions of pancreas, as well as they can give us this multilocular appearance as well. So they are distinct from mucinous. They are clinically as well as histopathologically distinct from mucinous cystadenomas. They are frequently seen in men. Mucinous and they occur because the pancreatic ductal epithelium has a mucinous transformation. So we have to, on radiology, we have to kind of try to distinguish whether it is a main pancreatic duct IPMN or a side branch IPMN, because the prognosis for both is very, very different. Sometimes there are mixed lesions as well, as one of the previous speakers also pointed out. So IPMN are quite tricky to diagnose on radiology, but when we do it, it gives a lot of protection as well as. So this is an MRCP sequence which shows multiple cystic lesions in the pancreatic parenchyma, and which are connected to main pancreatic duct. So these are multifocal intraductal papillary mucinous neoplasm. Again, a side branch intraductal papillary mucinous neoplasm. This is a heavy T2 weighted sequence. It is showing us a multiloculated contour with internal septations and a communication with the pancreatic duct, as seen in the MRCP sequence. So now coming to the fourth morphological subtype, cysts with solid component. So when we see cyst with solid component, what are the things which come to our mind? It can be either true cystic tumors or solid tumors associated with the cystic degeneration or cystic component. So when we talk about true cystic tumors, again, it is mucinous cystic neoplasm, IPMNs, and SPEN, of course, comes in the mixed solid cystic tumors. Then we have solid tumors associated with cystic component, where we can have islet cell tumor, solid pseudopapillary tumor, adenocarcinoma of pancreas, and metastasis. So this is a very, very special subtype of pancreatic tumor, which presents as a mixed morphology. We call it SPEN, solid papillary epithelial neoplasm. It typically occurs in the tail of pancreas in young women of African and Asian descent. Very benign, slow growth pattern. Tumor presents with mass effect, can present with pancreatitis, and if it is complicated with hemorrhage and cystic degeneration, we see CT with internal solid cystic components with enhancing capsule and solid components. Similar kind of imaging we see on MRI as well. So this is a classic example of a young woman presenting with SPEN from in the tail of the pancreas with solid enhancing areas within a well-defined cystic lesions. We can see that it is displacing the adjacent viscera and not showing the infiltrative kind of picture. So this is classic SPEN in a young female. Besides these, there are very rare tumors, true epithelial cysts, but typically when we've seen them, either it's a syndromic or one odd cyst, which is less than 2 centimeter in size. So this is one of the true epithelial cysts seen on heavy T2 weighted images. There are a few other examples of cystic tumors, which are quite rare. This is cystic islet cell tumor with a rim of fire enhancement on contrast enhancement on MRI. Adenocarcinoma with cystic degeneration, infiltrative looking lesion with cystic component with dirty looking enhancement, shaggy enhancement. So this is adenocarcinoma with cystic degeneration. So this is like a brief of what we've talked, that what are the most common lesions and how we kind of distinguish them on radiological features. All of this is covered with my previous talk, in the previous talks as well. This is the same flow chart of the systems approach we use every single time when we report a cystic lesion of pancreas. So again, this says that first of all, you categorize the lesion into these 4 morphological types. And in these types, see, symptomatic always will either lead to aspiration or surgery. The question arises what to do with incidental lomas. So this gives us a very clear-cut way as to what we can suggest to our treating doctors. So if it is, if it is a unilocular cyst and it is asymptomatic, we go with whether the cyst has those red flags, whether the size is less than 3 centimeter, whether the MPT is less than 6 mm in size, whether we have any shaggy wall, thickened wall, any enhancements on the wall. If we don't have, then we put the patient into the surveillance. So asymptomatic microcyst, we usually keep the patient in imaging follow-up according to the surveillance used in various organizations around the world. I'll tell you what we do in our organization. So again, cystic solid components, this is very, very high on malignant potential. So it typically goes to surgery more often than not. And a macrocyst with an symptomatic macrocyst, of course, goes for diagnosis with aspirations or typically we do some more invasive interventions for that. However, asymptomatic macrocyst again with those red flags goes into the surveillance, as spoken by my fellow speakers as well. So management, I'm not the right person to comment on management. More specialists are here, but yeah, we kind of have the same consensus that decision to follow rather than restrict. It's a matter of clinical judgment, risk-benefit ratio, whether it will be helpful for the patient or not. And if it is like a unilocular lesion, we discussed what to do about it. And the lesion is symptomatic or diagnosis is a question, surgical resection is undertaken. Mucinous lesions typically have high malignant potentials. According to international guidelines, estimated risk of prevalence of nasal cancer is 30% in symptomatic side branch IPMN and 0 to 5% in asymptomatic lesion. So asymptomatic we really have surveillance. So again, this is how we follow up the patients. If the lesion is less than 10 mm in size, we do an annual follow-up, 6 to 12 month follow-up if it is between 10 to 20 mm, and 3 to 6 month follow-up for lesions more than 20 mm in size. And if we see no change in morphology or size of the lesion, after 2 years of stability, we increase the interval from 1 year to 2 years, or basis what is the size. So the follow-up interval length can be lengthened. So that's from my side. Thank you so much for your patient hearing.
Thank you so much, Dr. Meenal ma'am. And it's my pleasure to reintroduce Dr. Tarun Mittal sir, who is also a panelist and now going to speak. He's going to present a case. Dr. Tarun Mittal sir, the screen is yours.
Thank you. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see.
Yes, sir.
Good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I bring greetings from Sir Gangaram Hospital, Delhi, and I thank the Thugs team, especially Dr. Vikas, for inviting me for this talk. And I have made some few case capsules and a video and some pictures. So this is our first case capsule. Is a 35-year-old lady who had intermittent pain in the epigastrium for past 6 months. Initially, they got an ultrasound done, which showed a 5 into 5 centimeter cyst in the body and tail of the pancreas. Then subsequently, CT scan was done to see the exact what are we dealing with. So it generally said that it's on the tail of the pancreas communicating with the main pancreatic duct. So just to be sure that we were planning for she was a young lady, we were planning for a spleen preserving distal pancreatectomy. So we just got a CT angiography done, and considering the patient was symptomatic, we did not go for EUS or US guide FNA, and which they shed a well-defined attenuated lesion with an internal septation in proximal body of the pancreas with minimal prominence of main pancreatic duct was done. So we are considering that it was not infiltrating the splenic vein, and we could identify the junction of the portal vein and the splenic vein, and we felt that we would be able to do a distal pancreatectomy and do a spleen preserving distal pancreatectomy. We went ahead with a diagnostic laparoscopy and did a spleen preserving distal pancreatectomy. Just to show you the CT films of this patient. So here we can see now the cystic lesion is there, which we can see here, and the splenic vein is far off from here. And the main thing which we have to see is obviously gross peritoneal disease and the risk of malignancy or not. What is the junction of the portal vein and splenic vein, and whether we will be able to do a spleen preserving distal pancreatectomy in lesions which are at in the body of the pancreas. Tail of the pancreas is little bit easier to do. So here just the films. So now we did a diagnostic laparoscopy, and there were no gross peritoneal disease. And then we went into the lesser sac, mobilized whole of the greater curvature of the stomach, so that the stomach does not come in our way when we are dissecting the pancreas. And now we are dissecting the lower border of the pancreas. Here we can see the cystic lesion, which is there, well defined, 5 into 5 centimeter, it said. Care has to be taken that we do not rupture the cystic lesion. So here we can posteriorly we can see the splenic vein, which can be easily be seen. So after that, we thought that we should take control of the splenic artery. And surprisingly, as we know that it's there in the upper border of the pancreas, but it was very difficult to be identified initially, and it was more posteriorly than at the upper border of the pancreas. So then we thought, let us mobilize the lower border of the pancreas, and then we will go there so that we are progressing. So slowly and slowly, we mobilize whole of the lower border of the pancreas, mobilize the splenocholic ligament also, so that we can easily lift the pancreas from above. So here we are mobilizing that splenocholic ligament. Here we had tear in the mesocolic area also. You could see the small bowel, which we closed subsequently later on. So now here, after this dissection of the lower border, we went to the upper border and started dissecting, and now we have started seeing the splenic artery. And slowly and steadily we mobilized the splenic artery. It was this splenic artery was seen very distally, so we had to come proximally, and it was a little bit posteriorly. So we mobilized this splenic artery distally first, and then we looped this vessel, this splenic vessel, as the most important part to be preserved is this splenic artery and the splenic vein, and they should not be injured. So after this looping, we started making a window from below, and here slowly and slowly we were able to mobilize the splenic vein. We went there, did posterior dissection, and then we did some dissection at the upper border of the pancreas, and so that a window can be created and we can fire a stapler. But this plane was a little bit densely adhered. Maybe patient might have had some attack of pancreatitis, but we were progressing well. So as we could see now, we have this splenic artery is looping and is twisting. We mobilized more of this splenic artery, as this was in the body of the pancreas rather than on the tail. So we had to mobilize more of splenic artery, and this took some time, but we were able to do it slowly and steadily. And this is the artery again, which is we are going more proximally, as we felt that margin will not be adequate unless we have good margin of the stapler and the lesion. We would not justify the spleen preserving pancreatectomy. So now after this slow and steady dissection, this window was created, and we first thought that only one stapler would be used, but then we did not compromise and we fired one stapler, and then again we fired one more stapler. And initially we were using blue or gold, but nowadays we are using white as pancreas is mainly fat, and it has given us good results. So after this, there are a lot of other techniques of division, but in laparoscopy, the best is this use of staplers. So after this, the difficult part is over, most difficult part. But yeah, this the pancreas was densely adhered to the splenic artery and to the splenic vein also, with some branching being given. So here we have mobilized this splenic artery, and we are dissecting now at the lower border of the pancreas and trying to separate the splenic vein from the pancreatic tissue. Small branches are being given away by these splenic vein, or their tributaries are there. So we have to be careful that they do not bleed. And a good energy source is important here. We are using our ligashore here. We can see this is the splenic vein, which is very densely adhered to the pancreatic tissue, and which is a normal thing which would be there in most of the time. So here we have done the spleen preserving distal pancreatectomy, and then subsequently, as there was tear in the mesocolon, we just sutured that defect. And as there are chances of pancreatic fistula, we generally place drain in the spleen preserving distal pancreatectomy. So then the biopsy of this came is to be mucinous cystic neoplasm, and patient is cured of the disease. The second case capsule, she was a 18-year-old girl who had come to the casualty with pain abdomen, with tachycardia, with hypotension, with low hemoglobin. There was on a CT scan was done, which suggested of a tumor in the tail of the pancreas, and the hemoperitoneum was there. So here we can see whole large tumor is there, compressing the splenic vein also. And here we can see the blood which is there. It was localized rupture, not generalized rupture of this tumor. Here we can see this blood is here trickling down in the left side, left paracolic gutter and left retroperitoneal area. So as patient was in hypotension and patient had low hemoglobin, so we did directly the laparotomy, and there was 500 ml in the left paracolic gutter, blood was there. And then we did a distal pancreatectomy with splenectomy. So this was the specimen, open specimen of distal pancreatectomy and splenectomy, and the biopsy came to be solid pseudopapillary tumor. The third is also a very interesting case in which she was a 28-year-old lady with pain abdomen, dull aching all over the upper abdomen pain. And then ultrasound was done. There was cystic lesion of the tail of pancreas. There was thin cystic lesion in the CT, 4 by 4 centimeter. No evidence of any solid component was there, but it was stuck to the splenic vein. And so we thought that we will not be able to do a spleen preserving distal pancreatectomy. So we planned for a splenectomy with distal splenectomy. Splenectomy with distal pancreatectomy. So this is a diagnostic laparoscopy was done. This is a cystic tail lesion of the pancreas. This video is done by my colleague. I've borrowed this video from my surgeon colleague. So here in upper border of the splenic artery was very easily felt, seen, and so we our plan was spleen preserving distal splenectomy with distal pancreatectomy. We divided the vessel. Then we took control of the splenic vein also, and subsequently I feel this might have been a mistake that he ligated it a little bit earlier and might have caused swelling of the area, but ultimately the result was fine. We did that tunneling, and we could make a tunnel, fire a stapler, and then 2 staplers were fired. And subsequently, after this fire, as we are doing a splenectomy, also this surgery is a little bit easier than the spleen preserving one. We just have to mobilize from posteriorly, take the splenic vein along with it, and with the help of a good energy source, we will be able to manage. And this is the spleen attachment which we are dividing. And the main surprise which was there in this histopathology was that the biopsy came out to be highlighted cyst of the spleen pancreas vis-a-vis any tumor. So these are my all the case capsules. We are open to discussion now. Dr. Vikas, you are open. You are muted, Vikas.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Tarun. We have got such a nice cases for this relevant this topic. And Delhi State Cancer is actually doing regular academics, and we definitely appreciate the collaboration of the Delhi State chapter with the Tugs India for such case presentations. And we hope that in the future also we will have such nice sessions with them as well. Now we can start for the question answer session, and when you can see that the questions from the chat box, there are few questions. One, I will start with our surgeons, Dr. Somil. Someone has asked whether the what exactly the indications for intervention is serous cystic neoplasm. Do we need to do any specific indication rather than in general for the cystic neoplasm?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Vikas. So first of all, I think all symptomatic cysts need to be treated. And if you have a symptomatic serous cystic neoplasm, it will need to be treated, which usually would mean a resection. Secondly, any patient who presents with pressure symptoms from the serous cystic neoplasm, which would include a jaundice or gastroduodenal outlet obstruction, which can occasionally happen, these patients would also require a relevant approach. Number three, it is not always very easy at times to identify or diagnose the cystic lesion with certainty, regardless of what you do. There will be a group of patients where you do all forms of imaging, EUS, tissue sampling, everything, and you just cannot determine whether it's a serous neoplasm, mucinous. So the diagnosis remains uncertain. And in such situations, I would offer an operation or a relevant resection to this particular group of patient as a benefit of doubt, simply because operation would be diagnostic, come therapeutic, and potentially curative. So I think in these three patients, I would would be my indications to intervene in patients with serous cystic neoplasia. Symptoms present, yeah. Symptoms, presence of pressure symptoms. Yeah, go on.
If the patient has a quite significantly large cyst, about 5 centimeters, 6 centimeters, but they don't present any symptom.
Yes.
And the tumor is in the tail of the pancreas. Still, do we need to get for the surgery?
No, so in that case, you would do an endoscopy. So if radiologically cannot tell you whether it's a mucinous lesion, so if you had a radiologically you were quite certain that, for example, if the serum tumor markers are elevated, or the CT scan or the MRI showed that yes, this is likely to be a serous mucinous cystic neoplasm, then I would not offer any further investigations. This patient requires a resection. The process of
it as a serous. Basically, radiologically, we are taking it as a serous. Then what we need to do?
Yeah, so in an asymptomatic patient, or in a patient who has got no pressure symptoms, like if there is no splenic vein compression, no regional collateralization, and if the radiologist can with certainty tell us it's a serous cystic neoplasm, I would choose to keep it under observation with a very close follow-up, so that you can intervene at any given point.
Whatever is the size, right?
Yeah, whatever is the size, because essentially in tail of pancreas, serous cystadenomas are rare but not impossible.
Another question is the fluid analysis always required, because we don't know whether it is a serous, whether it is a mucinous. Is the radiology can clearly demarcate that it is what is exactly the type of the tumor?
So fluid analysis would only be required when there is a diagnostic dilemma, or when you want to be absolutely certain that you are not dealing with a pseudocyst versus a mucinous tumor. So if your CT scan showed, or an MRI showed you very clearly that yes, this is a neoplastic lesion or a potentially neoplastic lesion, with the high risk features or the worrying features that we have just gone through, then you don't need to sample this cyst and unnecessarily try to obtain fluid analysis, because that's not going to change your management. So if you're dealing with a potentially neoplastic lesion which requires resection, you must do it. The greatest role for, I think, fluid analysis would come when you're dealing with small branch duct IPMNs, which can be kept under surveillance. And you would like to then know that, are you sure that this is a branch duct IPMN? In that situation, you would possibly require a fluid analysis to prove it. You look at the mucin, you look at the glucose, you look at the fluid CA and cytology. Because again, you may have a small branch duct IPMN, but if your cytology is positive, then you can't observe it again. So I think this would be an absolute indication where you would do an EUS with fluid sampling. But as I presented the case, and as Dr. Mittal has also shown, there was no need for any sampling of all these cases. If you are certain it's a neoplasm, you must resect it.
Dr. Punit, want to add anything else?
Regarding the first question about when in serous, so I think we have to balance the actual chance of serous cystadenomas causing pressure. It's very unusual actually for them to cause either symptoms or pressure symptoms, either pain or pressure symptoms. So quite frequently, when we looked back at, so we had collected from about 7 centers for the last 10 years all over the country and published it recently. And it was an interesting analysis. Almost 30% were, close to 30% were serous cystadenomas. So I think quite a large percentage of them probably should not have been operated. So when we looked at our own bits, many of them, the pain was actually historical. So it should not be the sort of the surgeon's pruritus for proactiveness in serous cystadenomas at least. So the risk of malignancy is very, very rare. There's only a very small series from Mayo which is done. Otherwise, all the others are very, very aberrant case reports. So that is not a real risk. Pain can be, so what the point I'm trying to make is we should look for other causes of pain, because, we might have say a peptic ulcer along with that, or, something else, and that persists after the surgery. So we should make sure that that is attributable to the serous cystadenoma. Then the second issue was about the fluid aspiration. So I think Saumil said that very well. I mean, practically, I just want to say, it's although we discuss it as type by type, pathological type by type, that comes to us only post facto. So as surgical jocks, most of us, what we'll get is a incidental cyst or a something which presents to us, and we end up operating, and then we realize what it is. So I think the importance of these sessions is to learn from our mistakes and make sure that we don't perpetrate those same ones time and again. So I think the EUS should be reserved when patients who are older, who have strong comorbidity. So basically any reason to not to operate. So it's, Saumil very correctly said, where there's a doubt of diagnosis, but I mean, I just want to stress the clinical scenario is when there's a strong reason, when you're thinking it's very unlikely to be malignant, we don't even have to aspirate. We can even do an EUS and just look for mural nodules, not only in IPMN, but even in the regular, cysts. We can look for septae and mural nodules and try and assess. And if there's a doubt, of course, look for mucin. Since mucin is such a strong predictor for malignant potential, I think that's the single most important feature which can differentiate which needs surgery. So, but that again, we should be, careful about that. If there's a high chance of it being, malignant potential, we should probably do the EUS and all that. And finally, I mean, I think we need to know our own data, because, we keep most of these guidelines are basically for IPMN, and IPMN actually is very much rarer in India. So of these, 450 odd patients we collected across from AIIMS Delhi, us, Tata Memorial, Lakeshore, and Asian Institute, and many other centers. The IPMNs were less than 8%, if I remember correctly. So a large proportion were actually SPNs. And another piece of, is that when we're looking at, so basically clinically what we will get is, a cyst in the pancreas. And when we now do radiology, obviously these would not have an antecedent history of pancreatitis. So although we say put that in the algorithms, it's very common in the south as compared to the north. North, we get a lot of acute pancreatitis. So pseudocysts are common, even the small ones which close to the pancreas or inside the pancreas. But in the south, it's very clearly that, if you get a cyst, it's almost always a neoplastic cyst, not an inflammatory cyst. So, I mean, just to know what are the common things in our own country, I think it's good to keep collecting that data. Thank you.
Sir, if we take the fluid analysis as a part of investigations, is there any role of therapeutic aspirations in the cystic neoplasm?
So there is, there are studies reported of using these, cytotoxics into the cysts. Again, it should be done in the elderly comorbid where you sort of convinced that surgery would not be an option. So if you're thinking that it is very likely to be a potential malignancy, it's probably better resected. So the mucinous tumors are better resected unless it's unilocular and you want to, the patient is a very high risk for surgery, elderly comorbid. Yeah. Sorry, somebody said something. Okay. Yeah.
Mobile se kiya fir.
Sorry?
It's okay. I think there is a mismatch. You can continue, sir.
Right. So, I mean, that would be the, otherwise, if there's a chance of it not being malignant potential, it's probably better to, follow it up. Saumil also stressed that we have, these are not very malignant tumors. We do get a lead time. So, the worry, we try to tell the patient that we have to operate it tomorrow is not there. We can actually longitudinally follow them up. And if they're, growing only slowly, very few of them, it's not like adenocarcinoma pancreas that, it's going to be lethal to wait 6 weeks or something like that. So the inflammatory ones will actually resolve. The slow growing ones, you can actually follow up them up even longer intervals after that. One, probably just to know that it's not growing at all, and then longer durations. And again, if it's head, we tend to follow up more frequently. You don't want Whipple's for a completely benign, non-malignant potential kind of a tumor.
Next question is for Dr. Meenal. Surgeons are actually very fond of the CT scan, other for the pancreas, for anything. We prefer the CT pancreatic protocol. But someone has asked what exactly is the indications for MRI in the PCN? When we should go for MRI?
So MRI, two things I think. MRI characterizes the lesions better than CT. And if you want to see the correlation with the duct, whether it is communicating with the duct, MRI is a definitely better choice than CT. So better characterization of the lesion. Am I audible? Hello?
Yes.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So better characterization of the lesion and the association with the duct. MRI basically scores over CT in these two areas. That's it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Another question is, how about there is a 4 centimeter cutoff for resection in cystic pancreatic neoplasm?
I think it depends on what neoplasm. Yeah, I mean, so if you have a mucinous cystic neoplasm, it needs to be resected. I mean, because of the reasons that we have elaborated. So every mucinous cystic neoplasm, suspected mucinous cystic neoplasm, regardless of size. So if you have a middle-aged female coming to you with a cystic lesion in the pancreas, showing a thickened wall, some nodules, the serum CA19-9 is marginally elevated, then this patient, regardless of the size, I mean, 4 centimeters, of course, is an indication, but even if it's a very small size, you could choose to observe with a very close follow-up, because a left-sided pancreatic resection is a easier resection to do. It's less morbid, can be achieved with minimally invasive means, and the outcomes are excellent even in terms of post-op outcomes and oncological outcomes. What you are looking at is the lesions, main duct IPMNs, regardless of size, would almost always require resection. So you're essentially looking at branch duct IPMNs or serous cyst adenoma more than 4 centimeters, which can they be observed? Well, yes, they can be observed. Or you're looking at lesions in patients who are unfit for an operation or refuse an operation, where you can just choose to keep them under surveillance and not investigate further. But as such, there is no 4 centimeter. Most of the international guidelines have brought out 3 centimeters as the cutoff limit, especially for branch duct IPMs.
And it is the same for the serous as well.
Serous cyst adenomas by definition do not require a resection unless they are symptomatic or there is a diagnostic dilemma.
Yeah,
So
as
we
discussed.
assume that there is no diagnostic dilemma and there is an established diagnosis. So in
And
that
I think
situation, you don't
this
require a resection.
intraductal papillary also should be more in terms of main duct, at least should be in terms of mucinous only, they should be collaborated, and most of them will require surgery. And many of them are symptomatic anyhow because of dilated pancreatic duct, might have got pancreatitis also. So they also require most of the time surgery.
Rahul, do you have any therapeutic uses in the endoscopy for this type of tumors? Are we using it?
So there has been,
Therapeutic.
so there has been data published recently about comparing alcohol ablation versus chemotherapic agents like paclitaxel. Until recently, alcohol was a choice, but the long-term outcomes and data about alcohol ablation have been quite sketchy and quite poor. The problem, what happens is with these benign lesions, that it's very difficult to follow these up. If you have ablated somebody, they come back in 3-6 months, you're aspirating and then you are ablating. So we don't know what the, Dr. Meena might be better saying, how is the CT MR appearances different after alcohol ablation, 3 months, 6 months, 1 year down the line. But the current data suggests that alcohol is not the of choice, but you should use paclitaxel chemotherapy as the treatment of choice for intralesional ablation. And as Dr. Saumil and Dr. Dhar mentioned, that these are only reserved for older patients who cannot be resected. So people who have a low CEA levels, they have higher glucose levels in the cyst fluid, a benign cytology on EOS biopsy, older age, non-resectable, you can definitely offer them palliative treatment.
I just wanted to ask Dr. Dhar and Dr. Mittal a question as well, if you permit, sir.
Yeah.
So I mean, we just discussed 2 cases where there was this cystic lesion in the tail of the pancreas or the distal pancreas, and the patient underwent in one case a spleen preserving, in another case a distal pancreatectomy with splenectomy. Now here, obviously, in both the situations, we didn't have a histological diagnosis. My question is, would you do a frozen section after retrieval of the specimen? Supposing you did a spleen preserving distal pancreatectomy, would you necessarily do a frozen section? Because if there is an invasive component, then there is a case for performing a splenectomy along with the distal pancreatectomy. I mean, not every time do you have the facility for a frozen section, or not every time do you get a convincing result on a frozen section that there is an invasive cancer present. So how would you deal with this diagnostic dilemma?
Sir, according to me, I feel that now the investigations are so well, so advanced, and with the help of CT angiography, CT scan, MRI, US, we are more or less we are able to judge whether we have to do a spleen preserving or a spleen along with splenectomy. As planes are well maintained, lesion size of the tumor, and then how much distance from the portal vein is the tumor. So if all these things are well, we know pre-operatively, then we can generally predict whether we will be doing a spleen preserving or a splenectomy along with distal pancreas most of the time. And I have not done frozen section in any of our patients. If you are in doubt, it is better to do a splenectomy rather than not do a splenectomy, and optimize these patients. We in one of my patients, I did the immunization 2 weeks before that. I might not be able to do it, and subsequently we were able to do it. But if in doubt, better to do a splenectomy rather than not do a splenectomy.
Dr. Puneet.
Yeah, I think that's a very important question, because most of the time we are resecting for the potential for malignancy. And it's the younger patients. So I mean, the push for minimally invasive and the removal of this, preservation of the spleen should not take precedence over what is the important thing to do. So I think if, like Tarun said, that if we need to resect the spleen, we probably should. If there's any lymph nodes, a large tumor or a reasonable chance of a malignancy, a definite mucinous tumor, we should probably not do it. So I think you're absolutely spot on if you say that if you're doing a spleen preservation, you should probably make sure that it is not a mucinous tumor, because mucinous tumors, we do want the nodal, we will never even know it. I've had a
Yes.
patient who was operated elsewhere and 17 years later came back to me, and we had to actually do a total pancreatectomy. So a lot of these issues can come. So I think you're spot on with the question. It's an important
Right.
issue.
Yeah.
Spleen preservation should not be that important. We can always give, this is not an emergency surgery. We can always give the vaccinations well in time. But younger patient, very young patient, we want to preserve the spleen, cystic neuroendocrine tumor or something like that. We might do that, yeah.
I think we have covered most of the questions. And anything, Dr. Puneet or Dr. Rahul, any Tarun sir, anyone want to ask anything?
I'll just add one, problem we had, which some of you might actually face, is since we don't have a pathologist on the panel, it's the mucinous cysts. Some of them, it's actually not, it is common in India when we look at the entire lot of cohort. But I think more serious get operated. But the point I wanted to make was that many of these can actually be, you don't need a ovarian stroma for diagnosis. Many authorities consider that to be important. The Japanese don't believe, because I think the tumors are commoner there and they end up doing more resections. But most other people believe that for diagnosing mucinous cyst, you need an ovarian stroma, even in males, to show ovarian stroma in the tumor. So some of our, when I was writing one of the chapters, I tried to get the photograph of this, just to demonstrate that. And one case I found there was no ovarian stroma. And I went back to the pathologist. We looked at all our mucinous tumors, and I found 3 of them actually didn't have the. So I'm just wondering, and just putting it to you, that some of these might be branch duct IPMNs, because they are mucinous tumors. So they might be sequestered, BD IPMNs. So we might be falsely thinking they're low. So just keep an eye for that also,
Yes.
and please do look at the ovarian stroma.
Yeah. So Dr. Vikas, if time permits, I just have one question to Dr. Puneet Dhar as well.
Definitely.
Yeah, Dr. Dhar, when I was in England at Royal Free, we used to do a lot of these cases, and we had on an odd occasion, we had a dilemma, like you do a Whipple's for a cystic lesion, it comes back as an adenocarcinoma in the background of a head pancreas lesion, cyst there. And it has happened on a couple of occasions that the pathologist comes back when you get the final histopathology report saying that there is dysplasia at the pancreatic cut margin, at the neck margin. I mean, you've done the operation, the patient has gone home, the patient had a main duct IPMN which transformed into a cancer, and there is high duct dysplasia at the pancreatic cut margin. How would you deal with this situation? Would you offer the patient another operation, or what would you do?
Yeah, I think that's a very important question. In fact, the first IPMN I had was it was a very interesting case. It was a CCP patient who'd been undergoing lithotripsies. So there is by the way, an association in India, at least, of the CCP with IPMN as well. So, it failed and he was still having pain. We operated and I found mucin inside. Now, this is about 18, 19 years back. The IPMN concept was still evolving. And that time the treatment was total pancreatectomy, and I didn't have a consent for total pancreatectomy. So I just sent those mucinous bits for, and there were these papillary projections also. We sent those and they were positive. I went out to the wife and she says, no, don't do a total pancreatectomy. And the guy subsequently refused a total pancreatectomy as well. We followed him up. Sometimes he was okay. And because we'd already opened up the duct, we did a salvage pancreaticojejunostomy. So, I mean, we can end up with a lot of issues like that. So the specific problem that you said has been addressed very well by the AIG group. What they say is you do so we now don't need a total pancreatectomy, that's for sure. But we have incidences in IPMN of discrete, they may not be contiguous. So I think in all main duct, if you're doing a Whipple and the rest of the duct is also dilated and you don't see on the CT tumor in the distal part, I think it's important to do a pancreatoscopy and some, if you don't have scopy, then at least some kind of a a pancreatogram direct, and to make sure there are no elements in the distal duct. So in your specific case, it is contiguous. So I think that answer is easier. But I just want to put the other side. You probably should do a slightly extended section.
Yes.
The issue of tannins in the margin, which we don't get in frozen section, we'll get probably in the permanent sections, is more contentious. But I'm really not sure what we followed up a lot of those patients. Some of them have got, some of them have been associated with biliary or gallbladder papillary tumors. So I don't know if there's some kind of a field change like the upper GI tumors, the multiple squamous malignancies you can get. So I think there is some papillary tumors which can have a field change as well. But what I wanted to stress was there is you can have discrete distal disease even without the contiguous one.
Yes.
If it's contiguous, of course, you do up to and including if required total. So I think we must take a consent, learning from my mistake, we must take a consent for total pancreatectomy, which will be probably very rare. But explaining what circumstances we would probably do it, because many of us in India believe it's not a good surgery. Actually, it is not that bad. It's got more bad press rather than actually being bad.
Yeah, in fact, I read a few publications from Verona where they said that if you have an IPMN in the head, they would preferentially want to do a pancreatic or gastrostomy rather than a pancreatic or jejunostomy, because maybe that's easier to monitor on an endoscopy. But I think one again has to balance the outcomes of immediate post-op outcomes versus that. I mean, it's not accepted practice, but I thought
Yes.
yeah.
Okay. We are short of time now, and now I invite my co-host, my coordinator, Dr. Bhushan, to give his concluding remarks.
Before I give my concluding remarks, I would like to make a few announcements. Can you see my slide?
You can see.
Yep. We TUGS have already started these studies. You can see on the screen there are about 10 studies in the 3 fields: bariatric surgery, upper GI surgery, and general surgery. These are based on collaborative authorship model, and I request all the participants, including the panelists and the speakers, to enroll for the studies, and we can increase the multinational enrollment, and you can have authorship in these studies as well. Also, there's a TUGS India group for further this invitations for other symposiums, which we keep on second Sunday of every month. So you can scan this QR code from your phones and enroll in this group too. The next symposium, the 5th TUGS India symposium, will be in collaboration with TUGS Hernia, Dr. Sarfaraz Beg, who had the TUGS Hernia. It will be on 13th of February at the same time on the second Sunday of next month. Finally, I would like to thank all the participants. I hope this symposium was very insightful. I like to thank the speakers and panelists for their time. And not the least, Dr. Kamal Mahawar and Dr. Vikas Jain for leading this program. Thank you. Good night.
Thank you, everyone.